I'm really grateful for all of you being here, and I'm also grateful for people who will tune in later, because not everyone wants to come out, but they all want to learn more about all the topics we're going to be talking about over the next 6 weeks. So up first, we're actually starting in kind of a strange place maybe. It feels like starting with funerals, except we all do know that we're going to die, right? And we know that all the people in our lives are going to die too, right? And as Christians, we also know that we're supposed to approach it differently, right? Doesn't mean we don't grieve. It doesn't mean we're not sad. It doesn't mean we don't miss people. But we are supposed to be a little more open about talking about these things without fear. And I brought along my handy-dandy occasional services book, which I use at burials. So every time we stand at graveside, and I do a commendation of someone, I read this scripture, which comes from the book of 1 Corinthians. If you want to know where in the Bible to look for the very best explanation of what happens after we die, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the book. And this is what I read. Lo, I will tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable nature must put on the imperishable, and this mortal nature must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? Where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is in the law, but thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. We stand graveside and we proclaim words of hope. Now, as we approach conversations about death, one of the most important things is exactly what I say to kids who are acolyting for the very first time. There will be people here to help you. So you don't have to worry about knowing which candles to light. Someone will tell you. And when you experience a loss in your life, there are always lots of people, and I know most of you have experienced pretty significant losses in your life. And you know that it's true. People come alongside, and they offer encouragement and support and have answers to questions that you didn't even know you needed to ask. But tonight, you can ask all of your questions. And if you'd rather not have your voice on the recording, you can write down your questions, and I will be the voice that asks them, because I know other people will be wondering too. So let's just start with a prayer, and then I'll introduce Scott. The Lord be with you. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks that we are able to talk about difficult and challenging things, but we're also able to laugh together and to hear just so much wisdom. We're grateful for Scott sharing his gifts tonight. Help us to open ourselves to learn just what you need us to learn. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So Scott is, as promised, a retired funeral director. And so he'll share all kinds of wisdom and then open up for questions, maybe throughout, but definitely at the end. All right. Thanks, Scott.
I retired just as the pandemic started, so I've had a couple years now to practice being retired. But prior to that, I was a funeral director. My father was a funeral director. My grandfather was a funeral director, and my great-grandfather was a funeral director. They started in funeral service back in 1894 and has continued on through there, so I'm a fourth-generation funeral director. I started in the field in 1986 through 2020, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. It was just a wonderful experience. I really enjoyed what I did as a funeral director. Tonight, the things that we're going to cover is a couple things about what to do when a death occurs, and depending on if a death occurs in a hospital or nursing home or at home. What's going to happen when you meet with a funeral director? What sort of decisions you're going to have to make as you meet with the funeral director and before you meet with the funeral director. Some of the options and choices that you have, things like that. But Before I do that, I'm going to read from a booklet called The Good Funeral. And this was written by a funeral director, Thomas Lynch, and he's much more eloquent than I am, but he talks about the good funeral. And he starts it out and he says, "A good funeral, my father always told us, serves the living by caring for the dead. He was a funeral director, so am I. So are some of my brothers, so are my son and some of his cousins, so will another son be when he finishes school. My sisters do the books and assist with the services. It runs in the family, it's what we do." It was a Saturday. 10 years ago, our father died. The heart attack that we always knew would get him got him in Florida the day after being at the beach collecting seashells for his grandchildren. Knowing it would happen did not ease the pain. The sudden, heartbreaking, breathtaking fact of the matter, Dad is dead. Nor did practice make us more proficient. Our mother had died 2 years before, too young, too soon, of an awful cancer. Love hurts, Roy Orbison sang, and he was right. Death happens to the dead and to the living. And whatever heavens our dead occupy, a death in the family can be a little hell to the ones who are left to survive it. We are caught in our bereavement between the will to do whatever we can and the will to do nothing, nothing at all. And that's where the funeral director comes in, helping you between the will to do nothing and the will to knowing that you want to do everything that you possibly can. One of the things that is always important, I feel, is to kind of understand why we have funerals. Why is it important to have a funeral? You have a dead body. What are you going to do with it? Why are you going to do something with it? I'm sure you've probably all been to funerals. Why, if it was a family member, why would you have a funeral? Anybody?
To say goodbye.
To say goodbye. It's one last time to focus on the individual and that person's life, to remember who they were, to recognize actually a very important event. Especially as Christians, death is not the end. And it bears stopping, taking note, and doing something special. A gentleman that writes a lot about funerals and things like that, Alan Wolfelt, came up with 6 specific things that he talks about, kind of a hierarchy, sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, same type of thing. And his first thing is to address the reality of the fact that a death actually occurred. You know, a lot of times when you hear somebody died, you know, what's the first thing you think? I can't believe it. You know, I just saw them in church on Sunday. How can they be dead today? It's only Monday. You know, they looked fine. So, you know, one of the first things you have to do is acknowledge the fact that, yes, the death occurred. And then he goes on to talk about recall. You want to remember the person, remember the life that was lived, the contributions that they made, you know, the things that you're going to remember about that particular individual. And then he also talks about support. You come together for a funeral to support one another. And that's so, so important. And I think a lot of people don't realize how important that support really is. And they don't realize how much people want to come and support you. You know, when my father died actually almost exactly a year ago today when we had the visitation, there were a couple people that came from an organization that I had joined less than a month before, because they had heard that the death had occurred, and they came out for the visitation just to support me. And I was so touched by the fact that somebody that I hardly knew recognized the fact that, you know, this was my dad that died. And it was important to me, and therefore it was important for them to come and help and support. So being open enough to allow people that opportunity to come and support is very important. And that's sometimes a hard thing to do. A lot of us think, you know, we can do it all by ourselves. And you don't realize how many people are there, as Pastor said, that will come right alongside you and help you through this. So many people have been through this before. They understand what you're going through. each death is unique, but death is death. And people have gone through very similar things with their own families before, and they can be there to perhaps offer guidance or support, or just the fact that they're there is so important. And he goes on to talk about expression, being able to share what you remember about the person, express the feelings that you're having. Some people are, of course, sad. Some people are angry. Some people feel very guilty because they're happy. There's all kinds of emotions that take place. And again, providing an opportunity where you can share those types of feelings in a safe environment is very important. Also, having a place where that can be the focus. It's very difficult. You heard somebody had died, and the next time you see a member of the family is in the grocery store. And it's a little hard and awkward to go up and start a conversation. Oh, I heard so-and-so had died in your family, and I'm very sorry, and what can I do to help? It's not always an easy thing to do. I'm a funeral director, and I'm supposed to know about this stuff and be comfortable with it. And when I'm presented with that situation, it's hard, because it's just not the same setting. You do that at a funeral home or at a church or something like that, well, that's why you're there. And people are expecting, that's what you're there for. And you know that that's why you're there. So it helps provide that setting. And I'm going to have to get my glasses because these last two get so small that I can't read them anymore. Oh, meaning, yes. To provide meaning. An individual has died, and it's important that we allow a set-aside time to recognize the meaning that that person's life had, that it is something that was important. I always found it difficult when people would say, oh, I don't want anything, don't do anything for me, don't have a funeral. And I always would think, what does that say about what we think of this particular individual, that we don't want to do anything? Did their life really have no meaning, that we shouldn't even stop and at least take a few moments to recognize the life that was lived? So it is important, I think, to take the time, have a formal gathering of some kind where you can acknowledge the fact that that life was meaningful. And then the last thing that he talks about is transcendence, which is different for each person. It provides an opportunity where you can think about things like life and death. Most people don't think about death very often. It's not something in our society that we talk about. It's got to be like the last taboo in our society. You'll talk about anything else. Anything else will be in the news, except talking about our own death or the death of our loved ones. It's just not something people are comfortable doing. But at a funeral, you do take time. You think about those things. And it provides an opportunity, especially to remind us of what we believe. That's, as Christians, I don't want to say death is what you live for, but that's kind of where we're headed. And it is important to remember what we believe. And a lot of times, especially on very difficult deaths or tragic deaths, it's important to be reminded about that fact. One of my favorite scriptures is the one that goes that, do not grieve as those who have no hope. Because it doesn't say do not grieve, but don't grieve as those that have no hope. Because we do have hope, and we have a promise. And that's what we need to be reminded of. As a funeral director, I'm reminded of that daily, that, there is hope. And I was, I think, very privileged to see so many different ways that is expressed. Each denomination has a different way of pointing that particular fact out. And I think some of the most difficult funerals I've ever been at are ones where there was no religion. Because then, well, yeah, you can remember the past, but now it's done. Okay? That's sad. There is no hope. But for so many of us, it's much different than that. We do have that hope. And that's what the funeral service provides an opportunity to remind us. Because when a death occurs, you forget all kinds of stuff. And it's important to be reminded of some of those things. So that's my soapbox of why we should have services and ceremonies. So I'll go back to what happens when a death occurs. You know, a death will occur in a hospital, in a nursing home, at a residence. And each place, things that happen actually at that time are a little bit different. If you're in a hospital, you have the medical personnel that are right there. They're the ones that pronounce the time that the death occurs, the nurse usually that's there. And there will be a time that a family can gather there at the hospital if they're not already there. So some time can be had for family to gather right at that moment. Once the family has been there for whatever period of time they'd like to be there, then generally the body is taken from that hospital room down to the hospital morgue in the same building and is held there until the necessary paperwork and forms are all completed. And then generally a family member, sometimes the hospital, but usually a family member, will be the one that will call the funeral home and let them know the death has occurred. The funeral home then coordinates with the hospital as far as when they can come and take the body back to the funeral home. If a death occurs at a nursing home, kind of the same thing can happen, as there is time for family members to gather, spend some time just together and with the individual when the death occurs. But then the nursing home will call the funeral home. Most nursing homes do not have any facility to hold the body, so they will want to make arrangements to have the body transported from the nursing home to the funeral home. Some nursing homes will have a set time. You know, within 4 to 6 hours, this has to be accomplished. So you kind of have to know what funeral home you want to be using fairly quickly. In fact, a lot of nursing homes will have that as one of the questionnaires. As someone goes into a nursing home, what's your funeral home of choice? And so you have to kind of designate that going in. You know, they kind of know how the story usually ends when someone's going into a nursing home. So that's one of the questions they're asking right up front. If a death occurs at home, what do? You know, if someone was on hospice, hospice will usually, the hospices we've worked with have always done an outstanding job of preparing families for what to do when a death occurs. And the thing that they always will tell you is call the hospice nurse first. The hospice nurse will contact the funeral home. They will also allow time for family members to gather. The hospice nurse will come to the home as well. And then once family is ready for the funeral home to come, hospice will let the funeral home know to come and take the body back to the funeral home. And that timing can be anywhere from an hour or so to sometimes half a day or even more than that if the family is waiting for other members to come to the residence. But generally, once a funeral home is called and told that they're ready for the body to be taken to the funeral homes usually will be able to be there anywhere from generally an hour to 2 hours. And that's almost any time that you call them. Day or night, that's how we're set up, is to be able to respond when we're called. So again, in a hospice, of course, works very well. They will already know what funeral home to be contacting. If you haven't been involved in hospice and this is an unexpected death, then what do you do? Some people will call 911. And while that is something that can be done when the paramedics come, generally their job is to try and revive the individual. Sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes if you know the person has died and family is comfortable with that, that's a lot of excitement that maybe doesn't need to take place. Calling clergy, calling a funeral director first, and the funeral director can help step you through what needs to be done. The county coroner would need to be notified. Depending on the situation surrounding the death at home, if there wasn't medical attention recently, may determine what happens from that point. The coroner may come out to the residence just to make sure everything is all right. The coroner may give the funeral director the authority to say, everything, looks like a heart attack, smells like a heart attack, it's a heart attack. And we'll offer some leeway to the funeral director. They may ask a police officer to go over to the residence to be the official representative of the coroner's office if they may not be able to go right away. And then the police officer would be there and help the funeral director and acknowledge, the fact that the individual has died and set a time of death and things like that. A time of death takes place when the pronouncement is made, not necessarily when the family knows the individual actually died. So there can be a difference between, it's 11:30 at night, the individual has died, you call the funeral home. By the time the funeral home gets there, or the coroner or the police officer, it's 12:30. Well, time of death now becomes the next day. And sometimes that's something that families aren't always comfortable with. They know when that person died, it was yesterday. It's not today. And so, working with the funeral director, there are certain official documents that have to say what day it was, but there are other things that you can say. Everything doesn't have to agree necessarily. They died on Thursday, but the death certificate has to say Friday. Well, maybe the death certificate's the only place that it says Friday. Every place else, family knows it was Thursday, and that's what they use. So once the deceased is taken to the funeral home, then arrangements need to be made with the funeral home to meet with the funeral director to go over the details and things that you're going to need to take care of as far as filling out a death certificate, a lot of statistical information, where the person was born, their date of birth. And that's always interesting because every now and then families find out that the date or the age of the individual that they thought they were really isn't their exact age. For whatever reason, they may have fudged their age for vanity or convenience sometimes. You need to know parents' names, parents of the deceased, and one of the challenging things sometimes to find is the mother's maiden name. If someone has been married a number of times, you may not even know the mother's first name because you're not affiliated with that particular line of the family going back. So those are things to think about that will be needed at some point in time is parents' names, dates of birth, place of birth, where were they born? Were they born in a town, in a rural area, in a hospital somewhere? It's those types of things. If it was not in the United States, just knowing what country an individual was born in is good enough for what the death certificate is needed, or what's needed on the death certificate. You'll also usually put together a death notice or an obituary. So knowing other family members, relationships, things like that, it's important to have that information available. And that's something that you don't always need immediately, but at some point in time, usually within a day or two of when the death occurs, you'll want to be putting that type of information together. Things that the individual was involved in, things that were important in their life, groups, organizations they belonged to, positions they held, whether it was president of a company, active in the community, what they enjoyed. They loved picking flowers, they were a marathon runner, they, whatever they did. Things that would be important that you'd want to have in an obituary. And that's helpful also for the clergy who's doing the funeral services. What's happening in our society today is fewer and fewer people are affiliated with a church. And so the clergy doing the service is not always someone that knew that individual well, or even knew the family very well. It used to be that you would talk to people, talk about people who came to church Christmas and Easter, and they were the Creasters. Well, I have a priest friend of mine who came up with a better one. He said it's hatch, match, and dispatch. You see him at baptism, you see him at a wedding, and you see him at a funeral. Hatch, match, and dispatch. It's hard to have a personal relationship with a clergy when you only see him 4 times in your life or 3 times in your life. So those are the types of things. In GLC, there's an awful lot of connection and people that have been around for a long time. But, as times change, maybe it's a minister that just got here and they don't have the history of the people in the congregation. And that's where it's helpful to know a little bit about the history of your family. Being able to talk about some of the history as well beforehand is important. Talking about what you may want to have in your funeral or for your funeral is important. And that's a hard conversation to have a lot of times because people don't want to talk about funerals, or definitely the fact that their mother, their father is going to die sometime. We would all like it to be sometime, but way out there. Nothing we need to talk about today because it's not going to happen today. But it's hard to have that conversation. As a funeral director, I talk about it all the time. Charity and I talk about, what we'd want for funerals, what we wouldn't want for funerals. Oh, thank you. Thanks. But that's who we are. We're funeral directors. It's nothing unusual for us to talk about funerals. One of my first times I really realized that being affiliated with a funeral home was different was when I was in high school. And I'd written a paper in English class, and after class was over and the teacher had graded it, she came up and said, how are you doing? Fine. What did I do wrong this time? Well, I read your paper. Oh, okay. No, I got it back. I got a grade on it. It was fine. How are things going at home? Fine. What's... Well, I was a little concerned when I read your paper. Okay, so what's the big deal? I wonder what it would be like to be dead. I live at a funeral home. I see dead bodies all the time. I'm not in any hurry to find out. I was just wondering. It was one of those assignments, write about anything you want. Oh, okay, well, I wonder. Okay. Most families aren't like that. And when something like that shows up, people get concerned. But it is a conversation you do want to try and have. It's difficult, like I said, it's difficult to start that conversation. Charity and I just happened to see the movie A Man Called Otto. And at the end of the movie, he writes out his instructions of what he would like. What's going to happen to the house, what's going to happen to the car, what kind of a funeral he'd like, just a simple thing, things like that. Well, when you've seen a movie like that, and you're thinking of maybe trying to have that conversation with your kids or with your spouse or something like that, that's one of those little openings. We just saw this movie and they were talking about what to do, when a death occurs and things like that. Have you ever thought of that? Or, Mom and I have been thinking about this and, this is what we thought. When we talked to Charity's son and mentioned, we had just gotten mausoleum crypts. And, his eyes get kind of big and, is there something I should know about? No, we just thought you better know at least where they are, because at some point in time you're going to need to know where they are. It's just one of those things. Being able to do a prearrangement where you actually fill out some very specific things you want, things you don't want. And then, like any document, it's important to keep it up to date. As I was preparing for this presentation, I happened to find my prearrangements, and they were dated 2008. They're a little out of date. There have been family changes. There have been family additions. There are a lot of things that need to change. And so that was a little reminder to me too. I do need to update it periodically. So those types of things, having even if it's not a formal prearrangement with a funeral director, just having some ideas is helpful as you go ahead and start planning. There's a lot of choices and options as you get started than actually making the decision as far as what you're going to do for either the funeral at hand or your own funerals. The biggest is disposition. What are you going to do with the body? There's a lot of choices and options there. You probably can name at least 2 or 3. Cremation, burial, donation to science. That's one usually people forget. Or entomb.
They're like composting?
In some states, that is now legal. Not yet in Illinois. So, but that's an option too. Green burials. It is a burial, but without any sort of preparation of the body, no embalming or anything like that. But it is an option too for people that feel very strong about having the body return naturally as quickly as possible. A very traditional Jewish burial is a green burial because they don't do any preparation. You can't have anything between the body and the soil, no grave boxes, things like that. So there's some options there. Even when you choose cremation, there are options after the body is cremated. What do you do with the cremated remains? Are you going to bury them somewhere? Are you going to put them up on a shelf? Are you going to put them in a niche? Are you going to scatter them somewhere that's meaningful? So even cremation isn't a final disposition. It's just a stepping stone into something else. And that's something a lot of people say, oh, I do want to be cremated. I don't want to take up, grave space. Well, that's great, but now you got to figure out what to do with the cremated remains. And that's important. We got a call once from the thrift shop down the block from our funeral home. They said somebody brought in an end table. We opened it up. There's cremains on the inside. No name, no dates. What do we do with them? Do you know who brought it in? No. We don't know. It was just here. We were starting to clean it up, and we found them. So we had a set of cremated remains brought down to us and asked that we find an appropriate way of taking care of it. And fortunately, we were doing a burial of unclaimed cremated remains. So they are buried at a cemetery. Everything is documented. And one of them is found in end table at Wise Buys. So anybody that happens to come back and say, hey, do you ever know? I think we left, cremated remains here. This is, we have a record of what happened. But, and that's one of the things that funeral homes are actually very good about, is keeping records. Anything that happens, they'll keep a record, especially when it comes to cremated remains. What happened to the cremated remains? Where did it go? Who has custody of them? If they were going to scatter them somewhere, if they were buried somewhere. They do a very good job of keeping those kind of all together. Another big thing you have as far as options is what type of service and ceremony would you like to have? Do you want to have the body present? A lot of people don't feel that it's important to have the body present. I lean definitely towards the side of it's important to have the body present. It provides a focal point. It does give people an opportunity to, at one last time, to be able to say goodbye to that individual or the remains of that individual. And in some instances, it's very important because seeing is believing. You can't believe somebody died. And that's unfortunately especially important with young people. If a young person dies, as a teenager, you're invincible. Nothing's going to happen to you. And whether it's accident or illness or whatever, it's important for young and old to know that, yeah, this death really did occur. And as hard as that is, it is definitely helpful going down the road, being able to say, yes, I was there, I saw the individual, they are dead, and you are now moving on from that point. So, but you don't have to have the body present, or maybe it's present just for immediate family. And for the community at large, it may be more of a memorial service, or the casket may be closed for others. Not having a body present at all, and just having pictures, or maybe the cremated remains present. Those are all options that you can have. Having a picture or cremated remains still provides a focal point, something for people to kind of focus on. A lot of times people bring in a lot of pictures and memorabilia of that individual. If they did things, there may be plaques all over of their accomplishments, or if they had a particular hobby, there might be golf clubs or bowling balls. Or we had one of a gentleman who was a self-proclaimed hobo, and he actually rode the rails. And so in front of his casket, we had a section of a train rail in front of his casket, because that was who he was. So, those are types of things that they provide a focal point and conversation starters too. Gee, I never knew they were involved in this or that. And that's so important a lot of times for families when you provide that opportunity for the community to come in. They get to see their mother, their father, who they only knew as a mother or father, in a whole different light. I never knew you did this or that. You never talked about it. Well, I didn't think it was important, but all the things that you get to see, it really provides quite a picture of who an individual was. The one thing I guess that is always important that I believe is talking. You have to talk about it. You have to talk about it with your spouse, with your family, children, whoever is kind of in charge. You want to make sure they kind of know what you feel would be important as far as service, ceremony, ritual, things like that. But then that also has to be balanced with what the survivors are going to need. When I'm dead, I don't need anything else, really. But whoever's left behind, they may need a few things. They may need to be reminded of what they believe. They may need to be reminded of what I believed. They may need a time to put everything else aside and recognize the fact that a death has in fact occurred. And it, hopefully, if it was me, it was meaningful. That, I was somebody worth taking time out and remembering. And I think that's true for everyone, that it is necessary to stop, take time out, and recognize the life that was lived.